Hello, hello, all you lovely people. I hope you're keeping up. I know that last video, it's intense learning about arguments if you haven't done this before, but I'll say don't panic. I just want you to have a rough sense of how to distinguish premises from conclusions. Don't feel like you have to get perfect at this. That's what logic classes are for. But I just want, if I say this is a premise or this is a conclusion, I just want you to have a sense of what I'm talking about. And if you are interested in getting good at this, I want you to have some resources available because I think this is important stuff that's pretty useful to have and get good at it. I mean, I don't diagram arguments often myself. I often do outlines, but diagrams, I think for young people just starting are very useful to just visually see something. So let's talk about argument diagrams. So these are often, I'm going to call them probably diagrams, but other people sometimes call them argument maps. Either is fine, of course. The reading does it a little differently than I do, just in terms of the shapes. I like boxes and arrows. The person does some numbers and things. I don't care. The concept is the same. And as long as you can do it one way, that's fine. I like this because it just kind of looks nice with boxes and things. But again, they provide us a way to visualize the inferential structure of the argument, which makes it easier to understand, I think, because it does give it a literal shape that we'll start seeing develop here. The basic idea is that just take each individual statement and put it inside of a box. Just write it out. And then you do those inferences, those becauses and sinces that are establishing the connections. You remember, literally now, I told you the statements were the building blocks, right? Or the bricks. Well, here they are. It's literally a brick now. And the inferences were the glue. Well, the glue will be symbolized using arrows. And the idea just is that the premise, it's like water. It flows to the conclusion. Or reverse, you can say like, well, conclusion. And you can say, well, why accept the conclusion? Well, let's follow the arrow back and see where it came from. It came from this premise. And we'll do lots of examples again in this video, but that's the idea. I mean, I wish I was like an artist because you could draw arguments like rivers, where the conclusion is like the delta that takes you into the ocean. That's where this has all been flowing to. And the premises, following these little arrows are like the tributaries and streams that are flowing in that direction. So again, the conclusion, we can follow backwards. Be like, well, where did this conclusion come from? It came from this reason, this premise, this evidence. Or if you like to go the other direction, it's whatever way you like. Hey, we're flexible. Or if you want to start, well, here's a premise, here's a claim. Well, where does this lead us? To the conclusion. Let's do some examples of this so I don't look crazy. But first, just the instructions for how to diagram an argument, because it's really cool. I like this. It's anything visual. I'm a very visual person. So parse the argument as usual. Rewatch the previous video for how to parse it. Then, like I mentioned, put all the argument statements into boxes, which I showed you on the previous slide. And then draw arrows from premises to the conclusions that it supports. This will actually get kind of interesting, which we'll see in this video, that things can now, once we get the arrows involved, that those little parsings that we did can start to get quite interesting once we put them in boxes and add the arrows. And I'll show you this. But again, the idea is we're trying to make the things as clear as possible to follow, just so we understand it. Because again, I don't know how often I'll do this, but I know for sure now and then I might show you an argument diagram in this class because it's just visually easy to see and understand what's going on. So my first priority is just that when I pop one of these up, you understand what the heck I'm doing. But even better if you can start doing these for yourself in your notes, even if it's just very sketched out. There's lots of cool stuff you can do with them. All right. I'm just going to do the exact same examples I did last time. So the parsing will be quick, and then we'll do the interesting stuff of diagramming it. So again, we have our old friend, the defendant must go to jail because he's guilty of stealing the jewels. I hope you remember. It wasn't that long ago, was it? Well, maybe when you take a break, it's like for a day. For me, this was just like 20, 30 minutes ago. Hey, man, that's why we're online. Do it however you want. Like I've told you repeatedly, get what you need out of this class. That's what you got to do. All right. Now, I said the second step was put the statements in boxes. So here we go. We have, and I just put the C just so you know what I'm talking about. If you wanted to, you could do it like the way the book does it and then just have only C in here. I'm going to write it all out just so you're clear what I'm talking about. But yeah, you can just put C in one box and one in another, and we look up and, okay, C is the defendant must go to jail. 1 is the defendant is guilty of stealing the jewels. I just sometimes write it out just to make it clear what the claim is. Like I got rid of the he, I made it, just some little clarification things. All right, so the statements are now all in boxes. Third step, let's draw the arrows. Again, the idea is the arrow goes from premise pointing towards the conclusion. Which way does the river flow? And so we had that because in there. And so the because says the defendant must go to jail. Why? Because the defendant is guilty. And so remember, in that case, the way I just read it is going up the river, if you will, or up the diagram. So we have the why. So I can look at the conclusion. Why must the defendant go to jail? Oh, they're guilty. Of course, if you like to think of it the other way, that's nothing wrong with that. The defendant is guilty of stealing the jewels. So they must go to jail. However you want to see it. Same exact logical concept that we're being told the defendant must go to jail on the evidence of being guilty of stealing the jewels. So, and I tend to, when I draw maps, so if you see me doing, you can do it however you want, as long as the arrows make sense and you can follow it. I kind of like to make the maps going top down towards the conclusion. So it's kind of like the Mississippi River flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, going from the top on down south towards the conclusion. It is the Mississippi, right? Okay, so again, flowing on south into the conclusion. I like my maps to go top down, from premises down to conclusion. But do it however you want. I think the reading does it the same way. And again, just to point out, again, the arrow here is the inference, and the premise is what's flowing down into the conclusion, just so we're clear on that. And maybe I should have written main conclusion there, but you get the idea. Now we can do some more interesting things, because I want to talk about this idea of independent premises. An independent premises is a premise that does not depend on anything else to provide support for its conclusion. So if I deny or remove that independent premise, that doesn't hurt how the conclusion gets support from any other premises. Now, this might sound vague and weird at first. I understand that. That's why we have an example. Because here's example argument 2, which we just did. So there's the argument as we parsed it last time. You can see I've put them into boxes. And recall we said that we were being given evidence for the defendant being guilty, and we were given 2 reasons. And these were 2 independent reasons for why you're claiming the defendant is guilty. Why is the defendant guilty? Well, 1, they signed a confession. That seems to be a pretty good reason. The arrow just flows into guilt. And you would say, and if that's not enough, the defendant was present at the scene of the crime. That's another reason, a separate reason, an independent reason for thinking the defendant is guilty. Now, this is when I wish I had magical powers and could just, they got to make an app where I can just swipe that and it disappears. Because notice, if I show that the confession was fraudulent, the defendant did not sign that confession, so we get rid of 1. 1 is shown to be useless and worthless. So we erase 1. But notice, we still have 2 there. The defendant was present, still a reason to suspect guilt. And vice versa. Suppose, nope, the confession's good, but we learn that we're not sure anymore if the defendant was present, so we erase number 2 here. But hey, they still signed the confession. So what I'm saying with these examples is, get rid of 1 of these, you still have the other one. So if I'm going to show that the defendant is innocent, I have to do 2 things: refute the confession and show that the defendant was not present. I have to do 2 things, each one, because if I only get rid of 1, the other one is still there. So that's independent premises. There's a separate arrow going in to the conclusion from each premise. So we have 2 arrows here. Now that's different from dependent premises. This is a premise that does depend on at least one other premise to provide joint support. The idea is you need both or multiple premises all at once to support the conclusion. And the idea is if these are depending on each other, if I can just kill or destroy or deny one of those premises, that the whole thing falls apart. Lawyers are very good at this, as you can imagine. That's why I like these examples. They intuitively fit. So here's our previous example 3. Again, the main conclusion being guilty of stealing the jewels. And here again, we're also offered 2 reasons. The jewels were found in the defendant's pocket, and the jewels would only be in the defendant's pocket if he stole them. But in this case, they're dependent. We really only have one arrow going into the conclusion, but it requires both of these together. So again, not separate arrows, but one joint arrow combining. The reading does a little weird thing I don't really like. I like this visually much, much better. And these are dependent because, especially because of two. Whenever you see a hypothetical, not always, but often, that is probably dependent on something else. Because look at two. It's just claiming the only reason they're in the pockets are if he stole them. That's hypothetical. It hasn't told us whether they're in the pockets or if the defendant stole them. It's just saying if they're in the pockets, then we know he stole them. So again, two is just giving us a hypothetical scenario. Isn't telling us about the real world yet. But combine that hypothetical with, the jewels were in the defendant's pocket. And if they're in the defendant's pocket, he stole them. So boom, they combine together. And so if I'm a lawyer and I want to show my client's innocent, well, I could just show that they weren't found in his pocket. So yeah, two may be true, but sorry, they were not found in the defendant's pocket. And so if I can erase one, two has no more value. And because it's just hypothetical. Or flip it. Suppose the jewels were found in my client's pocket. Now, I gotta get this guy off now. How the heck this? Well, I could deny two. I could say there are many reasons these jewels could be in my client's pocket. They're in my client's pocket because he was given them to hold by the owner. So he did not steal them. They were a gift or being held safely by my client. So if I show that two is false, that there are many reasons why these could be there, not just because he stole them, well, then doesn't matter. One is no longer showing my defendant's guilty anymore. So again, the idea with dependent premises is that these need to come together to support the conclusion. But if one of them turns out to be wrong, the other one's irrelevant, especially that hypothetical. Man, if one's false, they just say, Judge, we're dealing with realities, not hypotheticals. And the reality is they weren't in his pocket. So who cares about this hypothetical? Along those lines. All right. Very interesting. This might make you nervous. And this is why I said I've posted a bunch of examples. If you want to do, you can do. Because I think once you practice this, you get good seeing it. I know it's very hard to see me do it on a slide. I can show you this a million times. But if you don't practice it, I know it's tough. But at the very least, I hope if I showed you a diagram like this, you would understand at least what Professor Gray, I'm trying to show you. But practice maybe a little, just to get a sense of what I'm expecting from you. Example 4. Oh, this is where we get the chain argument. The defendant, so remember we saw this one, this was example 4, and we had talked about how the main conclusion, come on there, that the defendant was present at the scene of the crime. That's the main conclusion, so that'll be at the bottom. And we saw that we were given 2 reasons for that. And the arrows actually in this case go kind of nice. The defendant was present at the scene of crime. Okay, main conclusion down there at the bottom. And then I can always ask, well, why was the defendant? How do we know why defendant at the scene of the crime? Well, because his fingerprints were on the safe. So there we go. The fingerprints were on the safe. So I'm pretty sure there's an arrow going from one to that conclusion. And then I could ask, well, how do I know that these are the defendant's fingerprints? Well, we have a because for that, the forensic report. So here I've written out clearly now. It wasn't maybe as clear in the argument above, but here I've tried to make it a little clearer. Different people would do this differently. That's fine, but you get the general idea. This isn't a science after all. This is a bit of an art with what to put in these boxes, but you get the idea. The forensic report says they're on the safe. Therefore, they were on the safe. Therefore, the defendant was at the scene of the crime. This is known as an argument chain because we just keep going. We go, defendant was at the scene of the crime. Why? Fingerprints were on the safe. Why? The forensic report says so. Boom. And that's an argument. A lot of your arguments are probably going to be a lot like this. This might be the most common. Is just keep asking why. Why? Little kids love chain arguments, right? Because you say something and they're like, why? And they're like, well, why? And then like, why? And so we keep going back through the chain like we do here. And so here's where I'll just introduce one last piece of terminology just to help make sense. Is so we still have a main conclusion. The defendant was at the scene of the crime. And then we have the arrows are still inferences. And we have our pure premise, which is just the forensic report says. But now we can introduce the idea of a sub-conclusion. A sub-conclusion is something that's a premise because it's going into, it's going somewhere. It's not the end. But it's also, so it's a premise, but it's also a conclusion in the sense that the forensic, number 2 is telling us about 1. So sub-conclusions are just conclusions we reach along the way towards that main conclusion. So a sub-conclusion is still a premise because it's still supporting the main conclusion. Remember, a premise is anything that supports the main conclusion. But with those premises, we can distinguish just regular old premises that have no arrows going into them from sub-conclusion premises, which do have an arrow going into them and then one flowing out of. So again, sub-conclusion is just premises that are used along the way to get us to that conclusion, a little pit stop. And we can even now take this whole thing, all the 4 arguments I've made, and put it into one super argument, because you'll notice this has all been about why the defendant must go to jail. And then we back up, why must they go to jail? Guilty of stealing the jewels. And then we get some different reasons for why the defendant is guilty, whether it's just a single reason or a more dependent reasons that we saw earlier. But again, this is just taking literally everything I've just done and putting it all into one map. And then you really do get to see how complicated it is, where we have the river getting bigger, go to jail, guilty. Well, we have a tributary from here. We have a tributary coming from here. We have another tributary or stream coming from over here, all coming together about why they're guilty. And then from that, concluding the defendant must go to jail. And this is kind of nice because I will be asking you at times to summarize arguments in this class for work. And so now you can take that previous diagram and put it into a short paragraph that summarizes the argument. The defendant must go to jail because he's guilty of stealing the jewels. We started at the bottom, and then we just work our way up, guilty of stealing the jewels. There are 3 sets of reasons for this. I'll quickly flip to the previous one. Here's our 3 sets of reasons. One about the fingerprints being at the crime, another about the jewels in the pocket, and a third reason about the confession. So you can already anticipate what's going to go. There are 3 sets of reasons. First of all, the defendant signed a confession. I just showed you that. Second, the jewels were found in the defendant's pocket, and they would only be there if he stole them. So that's our dependent little argument we made about, the hypothetical on the pockets. Third and finally, the forensic report says, and now here we go, we're going to go up that argument chain. The forensic report says they're on the safe, and so his fingerprints must be there on the safe, thus implying he was at the scene of the crime. Actually, I went down the stream there. I was clever. I went with the forensic report, and then that leads to fingerprints on the safe, leads to present at the scene of the crime. Lots of different ways. This is only, like I said, it's an art form. There's many ways you could take this exact same diagram and summarize it in a paragraph like this. I just did one way. And you notice I used lots of indicator words, becauses and so and thus. Use those indicator words in your own writing. Your reader will thank you for it. Your professor grading will thank you for it. And I've been told repeatedly by professors in other classes how much they appreciate when their students make their argument clear by using lots and lots of indicator words. And then number things. So I number my premises 1, 2, and 3. So we can walk through again, corresponding to 1, 2, 3, confession 1, pockets 2, scene of the crime 3, and then we work through it accordingly. All right. That is more than enough about arguments from me. Again, I'll put on the webpage, if you scroll down, you'll see just a sample problem set and solutions. You don't have to do it if you don't want. If you watch this and you get it, fantastic. If you want to play around and see some different forms of arguments, you have it there as well. I will say I would maybe study them a little bit, since I will obviously be doing a little bit of diagramming stuff on the quiz for this module. So take a look, see what you think. And if you're still struggling, don't hesitate to see me. All right. That is plenty. So, hey, you can't see me now, but I'm patting myself on the back. Get rid of that arm flab. You've completed, or almost have completed, another module. The last module before the exam will be about the opioid crisis, and we'll actually start applying this stuff. But hey, don't need to worry about that right now. Finish up this module, and then pat yourself on the back and get rid of that arm flab. All right. Take care. Stay safe.